The frost hadn't fully burned off the fescue by the time Caleb Turner pulled his truck into the gravel lot behind the Whitfield place, and he sat there a moment with the engine ticking, looking at the crowd already gathering around the equipment row. He had $400 and some change in his checking account and a lease payment due on the 50 acres he'd taken on that spring, ground he still wasn't sure he could make pay, and he'd told himself on the drive over that he wasn't buying anything today. He was only looking. He'd told himself that before, plenty of times, and it had never once turned out to be true. The Whitfield auction had been posted in the county paper for 2 weeks straight. The whole outfit going, house and land already sold separately to a nephew from Springfield who had no use for either, and everything mechanical getting sold off piecemeal on a cold Saturday in late October. Old man Whitfield had died back in the spring, 81 years old, and from what Caleb had heard around the feed store, he'd farmed that ground alone for the better part of 3 decades after his wife passed, stubborn as a fence post about doing things his own way right up until the end. Nobody Caleb talked to could say they'd known him well. Everybody had a story about seeing him, though. Out working a field alone at dusk, turning down offers from developers twice his neighbor's asking price, never once hiring help, not even the year he broke his wrist. Caleb walked the equipment row before the bidding started, the way he always did at these things, running his eye over disc harrows gone orange with rust, a hay rake with a bent tine, a stock trailer that looked serviceable if you didn't examine the floor too closely. And then, near the end of the row, half hidden behind a stack of wooden pallets somebody had shoved out of the way, he saw the tractor. It was an old Farmall, faded red, gone the color of a dried clay riverbank, sitting on tires that still held air but hadn't rolled far in years judging by the grass grown up through the front axle. 60 years old if it was a day. Caleb crouched down and looked underneath it out of habit, checking for cracked housings, oil leaks, the kind of rot that told you a machine was done for good. What he found instead, tucked up under the rear end, was a modification he didn't recognize right off. The drawbar assembly built out wider and heavier than anything that would have come stock from the factory, reinforced with plate steel that had been cut and welded by hand, not machine-stamped. Somebody had built that hitch to pull something a lot heavier than a hay wagon. He didn't think much of it at the time. Old farms accumulated strange modifications the way old houses accumulated strange additions. A room added on for a reason nobody remembered. A gate hung a certain way because of a dog that died 40 years back. He figured whoever farmed that ground before Whitfield, or Whitfield himself in some younger, more ambitious season, had needed to drag something heavy across the property once, and had built the hitch to do it. It ran, or so the auction flyer claimed. That was enough for Caleb. He needed something to move round bales and pull a manure spreader on the leased ground, and the newer equipment on the row was already drawing the kind of attention that would push it past what he could spend. The bidding on the tractor started slow. A man Caleb didn't recognize, heavyset, wearing a feed cap from a co-op 2 counties over, put in the opening bid without much enthusiasm, like he was doing it out of habit rather than genuine interest. Caleb came in above him. The heavy-set man came back once, half-heartedly, and then let it go. Nobody else seemed to want it. The auctioneer, a wiry old man named Henry Cross, who'd been running these county sales for as long as Caleb could remember, brought the gavel down at $800. And just like that, Caleb Turner owned a tractor he hadn't planned on buying that morning, same as always. He was still filling out the payment slip at the folding table near the barn when he felt someone come up close behind his shoulder, closer than the space really allowed for. "You buy the Farmall?" It wasn't really a question the way the man said it. Caleb turned. The speaker was older, maybe 70, lean in the particular way of a man who'd spent his whole life doing physical work and never developed the softness that came to most people by that age. He wore a canvas coat gone thin at the elbows and held his hat in both hands like he was at a funeral, turning the brim slowly between his fingers. "I did," said Caleb. "Something wrong with it?" No, ain't nothing wrong with it." The man glanced past Caleb's shoulder toward the tractor, and something crossed his face that Caleb couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly, and not fear, but something adjacent to both. "Name's Earl Bennett. Used to do mechanic work around here way back. Knew Whitfield some." He paused. "I'll give you $1,000 for it, cash, right now, before you even get it loaded." Caleb looked at him for a second, waiting for the rest of it. The explanation, the reason a man would show up to a farm auction and offer 25% more than the winning bid for a tractor that hadn't drawn any real interest 5 minutes earlier. The rest of it didn't come. "I paid $800, Caleb said slowly. "You're offering $1,000 for this exact tractor." "That's right." "Why?" Earl's jaw worked for a moment, like he was chewing on an answer before deciding against it. "Just interested in it is all. Old equipment. Hobby of mine." It was, Caleb thought, one of the least convincing things he'd heard a grown man say in a good while. Earl Bennett didn't look like a man with money to burn on a hobby, and he sure didn't look like a man who'd driven out to a dead stranger's auction on the off chance of picking up 60-year-old scrap iron for sentimental reasons. His hands were shaking slightly, and it wasn't cold enough that morning to account for it. "I appreciate the offer," Caleb said, "but I bought it because I need it. Got 50 acres I just took on lease, and I'm short on equipment." "You don't need that one." Earl said it fast, almost sharp, and then seemed to hear himself and pulled back. "There's better tractors out there for the money. I could point you toward one. Better condition, better price, save you the trouble." "This one runs. That's mostly what I'm after." Caleb studied him. "You sure there's nothing wrong with it you're not telling me?" "Nothing wrong with it," Earl repeated, and something in the flatness of his voice told Caleb that whatever was true about that tractor, wrong wasn't really the word for it. Earl looked toward the barn, toward the row of vehicles still lined up waiting for bids, anywhere but directly at Caleb. $1,200 then. That's a real fair price for a machine that old." Caleb had bought and sold enough equipment over the years to know when a number was climbing because a man wanted something, rather than because the thing itself was worth it. And this was climbing fast. He also knew, with the particular certainty of a man who'd been broke more often than not, that whatever this was about, it wasn't really about the tractor. "I think I'll hang on to it," Caleb said. Earl stood there a moment longer, and for just a second Caleb thought the older man might say something else, might finally give him the piece of it that would make any of this make sense. Instead, Earl put his hat back on, nodded once, short and tight, and walked off toward the parking area without another word, moving faster than a man his age generally moved. He didn't look back. Caleb watched him go, then looked back at the tractor sitting there in the weak morning light, at that oddly reinforced hitch built for pulling something heavier than any hay wagon Whitfield would ever have owned, and felt the particular unease of a man who just realized he doesn't understand something he thought was simple. Henry Cross wandered over a few minutes later to help him with the paperwork, and Caleb, more out of curiosity than anything, mentioned Earl's offer. "Bennett," Henry said, shaking his head slightly, the practiced neutrality of an auctioneer slipping for a moment. "Funny thing, had 3 different people call the office this week before the sale ever posted proper, asking was that particular tractor going to be in the lineup. Never had that happen before, not for a machine that old and that unremarkable. I figured somebody around here just liked old Farmalls." He looked over at it, sitting there behind the pallets, and didn't say anything else for a moment. "You got a trailer big enough to haul it, or you need me to find you one?" Caleb said he had a trailer. What he didn't say, because he didn't yet have words for it, was that he had also just bought something he no longer fully believed was only a tractor. Caleb hauled the Farmall home that same afternoon and left it sitting in the equipment shed for 3 days before he got around to running it, mostly because the lease payment was weighing on him harder than any curiosity about an old man's hitch modification. When he finally did start it up, it turned over rough but caught, and he spent an hour that Tuesday pulling the manure spreader across the back field, telling himself the whole while that Earl Bennett had probably just been a strange old man with more money than sense, and that strange old men showed up at every auction in the county sooner or later. He mostly believed that, right up until Friday morning, when a car he didn't recognize came up his gravel drive and parked behind his truck. The woman who got out was maybe 60, dressed like she'd come straight from somewhere else, town clothes, not farm clothes, a coat too nice for tramping around equipment shed. She stood by her car for a moment, looking at the Farmall through the open shed doors before she came any closer, and something about the way she looked at it, the particular stillness of it, reminded Caleb uncomfortably of Earl. "Mr. Turner," she said when she'd crossed the yard. "I'm Sarah Grayson. Wallace Whitfield was my father." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag and came out to meet her. "Sorry for your loss," he said, because it seemed like the thing to say, and because he genuinely was, in the vague way you're sorry for the loss of someone you never knew. "Thank you." She glanced past him at the tractor again. "I understand you bought this at the auction last weekend." "I did." "I'd like to buy it back from you. I'll pay you $1,600 for it, twice what you paid, plus something for your trouble." Caleb felt something settle into place in his chest, cold and certain, the specific feeling of a coincidence stopping being a coincidence. "That's the second offer I've had on this tractor in a week," he said. "First one was from a man named Earl Bennett at the auction itself. You know him?" Something moved behind Sarah's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or something closer to alarm, before she smoothed it back down. "I know who he is," she said carefully. "We're not close." "He wouldn't tell me why he wanted it either." Caleb crossed his arms. "I don't mean to be difficult, Mrs. Grayson, but I've got 50 leased acres and no other tractor that runs reliably, and I'd like to understand what it is about this particular piece of equipment that's got two different people showing up wanting to pay double what it's worth before I decide whether or not I want to sell it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Caleb watched her decide something, the way people did when they were choosing between two different versions of an explanation. "My father asked me, near the end, more than once, that if anything ever happened to this tractor, if it was ever going to leave the farm, that I make sure it stayed with the family. He was very particular about it. I didn't understand it at the time, and honestly, I don't fully understand it now, but I promised him." She looked at the tractor again, and this time, something genuinely pained crossed her face, something that didn't look rehearsed at all. "Why would your father care that much about an old Farmall?" "I don't know," Sarah said, and for the first time, Caleb believed she meant it, even if he suspected it wasn't the whole truth. "He never told me. He just made me promise." $1,600's a lot of money for a promise you don't understand the reason for. "It's not really about the money to me, Mr. Turner. I'd pay more if I thought you'd take more." She said it plainly, without any performance in it, and that plainness was somehow more unsettling than anything Earl had said at the auction. "Is there anything I could tell you that would change your mind about selling?" "Maybe the truth," Caleb said. "Whatever it is you and Earl Bennett both seem to already know and neither one of you wants to say out loud." Sarah's mouth tightened, and for a moment Caleb thought she might actually tell him. Instead, she reached into her coat and handed him a business card with a phone number written on the back in pen. "If you change your mind," she said, "call me, any hour." And then, almost as an afterthought, standing halfway back to her car, "Whatever Earl told you, or didn't tell you, he's not lying to protect himself. Whatever he's protecting, it isn't him." She left before Caleb could ask what that was supposed to mean. He didn't have to wait long for the third piece of it. The following Tuesday, a man showed up at the feed store while Caleb was loading sacks into his truck bed. A wiry old-timer named Roy Walker that Caleb recognized by sight, but had never had much reason to talk to. Roy had worked as a hired hand on half the farms in the county at one point or another, going back decades, before arthritis had put an end to the heavier work. "Heard you bought Whitfield's old Farmall," Roy said, by way of greeting, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. "Word travels fast around here." "Always has." Roy shifted his weight, glanced toward Caleb's truck like he could see the tractor sitting in the shed 3 miles away. "That the one with the built-up hitch on the back? Reinforced, welded-up heavy?" Caleb went still. He hadn't mentioned the hitch to anybody but Earl, and Earl certainly hadn't been the one talking. "How'd you know about that?" Roy's face did something complicated. Recognition, and underneath it something that looked almost like old grief, worn down soft at the edges the way grief got after enough years had passed. "I worked that farm a while back, before Whitfield really took it over full-time. I was there when that hitch got built." "Then maybe you can tell me what it was for." Roy looked at him for a long moment, and Caleb thought, the same way he'd thought with Sarah, that this was the moment somebody was finally going to just tell him the truth plainly, the way you'd expect one grown man to tell another. Instead, Roy's jaw tightened, and he shook his head slowly, like he was arguing with himself and losing. Some things ought to stay where they got left. That's all I'll say about it. You do well to let that machine be what it looks like, an old tractor, and not go digging at what it used to pull. He hesitated, and something almost apologetic crossed his face. I ain't tried to be unkind to you, son. You didn't ask for any of this. But there's people around here it'd hurt bad, one way or another, if that got dragged back up. I've kept quiet about it 30 years. I don't aim to be the one who breaks that now, to a stranger, over feed sacks. Roy. But Roy was already turning to go, moving with the particular finality of a man who'd said more than he meant to already and knew it. Caleb stood there in the parking lot a moment, sacks of feed still in his arms, and did the arithmetic on what he now had. A mechanic who'd built the hitch and wanted the tractor gone before anyone looked at it too closely. A dead man's daughter bound by a promise she didn't understand, warning him that Earl wasn't protecting himself. A former farmhand who'd been there when it was built and who'd apparently spent 30 years keeping quiet about whatever it had once dragged across that ground. 3 people. 3 different pieces. Not one of them willing to hand him the whole picture. He drove back out to Henry Cross's place that same evening on a hunch and found the old auctioneer out on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. Those 3 calls you mentioned, before the auction, you remember who they were from? Henry studied him for a moment before he answered, like he was deciding how much of his own caution to set down. One was Bennett, he said. One was the Grayson woman, Whitfield's daughter. And the third... He paused, frowning slightly, like the memory itself didn't sit easy with him. Third one, I never did get a name. Older man, wouldn't say who he was, just asked real carefully whether a modified Farmall with a reinforced drawbar was going to be part of the sale. When I told him it likely would be, he thanked me and hung up before I could ask him a single thing back. Henry shook his head. In 40 years running these sales, I never had 3 separate parties call ahead asking for one piece of equipment nobody else in the county would have looked at twice. Whatever that tractor pulled once, Mr. Turner, it wasn't hay. Caleb sat with that a long moment, looking out over Henry's dark pasture, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only once a mystery has stopped being interesting and started being real, that there was a 4th person out there who wanted that tractor gone or found, and who hadn't been willing to give even his name to get it. Caleb spent most of that weekend telling himself he had better things to do than chase down an old man's secrets. Fence to mend, a lease payment still owed, a truck that needed a water pump before winter set in proper. He got maybe half a day's real work done before he found himself driving out to the old Whitfield place anyway, the nephew from Springfield having given him a loose kind of permission over the phone to look through what was left in the outbuildings, so long as Caleb didn't mind doing the hauling himself. The nephew, it turned out, wanted nothing to do with any of it. He'd said so plainly, in the flat voice of a man settling in a state he had no attachment to. Take whatever's useful. I don't want it, and I sure don't want to drive out here again. The workshop sat behind the main barn, a low cinder block building Caleb hadn't paid much mind to at the auction because none of its contents had been part of the sale. Just personal effects, tools, papers, the accumulated residue of a man's working life that a nephew from the city had no use sorting through. It smelled like machine oil and dust and something else underneath that, something old paper and closed up, the smell of a room that hadn't had its windows opened in longer than Caleb wanted to guess. He found the ledger on the second shelf of a metal cabinet, wedged behind a stack of parts catalogs gone soft and curled at the edges. It wasn't what he expected. He'd half hoped for maintenance records, oil changes, part numbers, the ordinary bookkeeping of a man who took care of his equipment, and for the first dozen pages, that was more or less what he got. Dates, repairs, a carburetor rebuilt in 1987, new tires in 1991. Then, about a third of the way through, the entries changed. June 14th marked the line at the old sycamore stump, 40 paces east of the creek bend, same as before. EB present. RW present, agreed same as last year. Line stands where we set it, not where the deed says, neither family to move it without both sides present. Caleb read it twice, Then he flipped forward and found more of the same scattered through the pages between ordinary repair notes, like something the old man had wanted recorded but hadn't wanted obvious. A boundary, referenced again and again over what looked like nearly 3 decades, always described by landmarks instead of survey coordinates, always noted with the same pair of initials present: EB, Earl Bennett, RW, Roy Walker. Near the back of the ledger, in handwriting shakier than the earlier entries, dated only 4 years before Whitfield died, Caleb found the passage that stopped him cold. Flood took out both stakes again this spring, same as 61. Talked with Delbert about it. Deeds line and the line we've farmed by ain't the same, and ain't been since we moved it after the first flood. And by now there's nobody living who could prove different except what's marked here and what Earl built to move the stone. If it ever comes up, tell them ask Earl about the hitch. He'll know. I won't be here to say it myself forever. Caleb sat on an overturned bucket in that cinderblock workshop for a long while after he read that, the ledger open on his knees, piecing together what he now had. A hitch built heavy enough to drag something a lot bigger than a hay wagon. A boundary that had been quietly moved and quietly re-agreed to year after year by 2 families who both knew the deed said one thing and the ground had been farmed as something else for going on 60 years. A flood mentioned twice that seemed to be the reason any of it had started in the first place. He thought about Sarah's promise made to a dying father who wouldn't explain it. He thought about Roy, standing in the feed store parking lot saying some things ought to stay where they got left. He thought about Earl's shaking hands at the auction, offering money he probably didn't have to spare for a machine he'd apparently built the most important part of himself. He drove straight to Earl Bennett's place from the workshop, ledger on the seat beside him, and didn't call ahead. Earl answered the door looking older than he had at the auction, like the intervening days had cost him something. He didn't ask Caleb in. He stood in the doorway with his hand still on the frame, and when Caleb held up the ledger, open to the page about the hitch, something in Earl's face simply gave way. The way a fence post finally goes after years of a tree root working underneath it. "Where'd you find that?" Earl said. It wasn't really a question either. "Whitfield's workshop. He wanted somebody to find it," Earl said. "Right there on the page. Said if it ever came up, ask you about the hitch." Caleb kept his voice even, not accusing, just tired and wanting an actual answer after a week of half ones. "So I'm asking." Earl was quiet long enough that Caleb thought he might close the door without saying anything at all. Then he stepped back and gestured Caleb inside, toward a kitchen table that looked like it hadn't had 2 people sitting at it in some time. "There was a bad flood, spring of 1961, Earl said, sitting heavy across from Caleb, not looking at him so much as at some fixed point on the table between them. Took out the creek stakes that marked the property line between the Whitfield place and the cross ground next door. Old survey markers, wood, gone soft with rot even before the water got to them. When the water went down, wasn't nobody entirely sure anymore exactly where that line had run. Deed said one thing, on paper, but paper don't tell you where a fence used to stand, or where a man's daddy always told him the line was, and both families had been farming right up to what they believed was the boundary by 2 generations by then. So what happened? Wallace Whitfield and old Delbert Cross sat down together, and instead of dragging surveyors and lawyers into it and maybe losing land either one of them had worked their whole lives, they agreed on a line themselves. Split the difference some, best either of them could remember and reckon fair. Had me build that hitch heavy enough to drag a marker stone from the creek up to where they'd agreed the new line ought to sit. I was young, good with a welder. Didn't think much past doing the work I was asked to do. Earl's hands, folded on the table, had started that same faint shake Caleb had noticed at the auction. That same faint shake Caleb had noticed at the auction. Roy was there too, helped set the stone once we'd dragged it up. And every year after that? Every year near about, they'd walk it together, make sure nothing had shifted, note it down somewhere private, never once put it on record with the county. Kept farming their own sides of that line like it was gospel truth, and it worked because both families agreed to it and neither one ever pushed. Earl finally looked up at him. Only trouble is, son, that line as they agreed it gives the Cross family near 11 acres of good creek bottom ground that the actual deed, if you go back and read it plain, puts on the Whitfield side. So if that line ever got challenged, if somebody proved the old agreed line instead of the deed line, then somebody's about to lose 11 acres they never had any legal right to be farming in the first place, even though they farmed it in good faith, same as their daddy did before them, and never once knew different. He looked toward the window, toward some middle distance that had nothing to do with the kitchen. And that tractor is about the last thing left in this world that can prove where that stone actually got dragged to, and when, and who agreed to it. Everything else is memory. Mine's failing. Roy's arthritis has got worse than his memory, if you want the truth. Wallace is gone. That leaves that hitch and whatever else Wallace wrote down and I don't know about. Who called Henry Cross before the auction? Third caller, wouldn't give a name. Earl's face went carefully blank in a way that told Caleb more than an answer would have. Couldn't tell you, he said, and this time Caleb believed the shape of the lie even less than he'd believed the first one back at the auction, not because Earl was hiding who it was, but because Caleb was fairly sure Earl actually knew and had decided, sitting right there at his own kitchen table, that this was one piece he wasn't yet ready to hand over. Caleb didn't have to go looking for the fourth piece of it. It came looking for him. He was out mending fence along the leased ground 2 days later, still turning the ledger's entries over in his mind, when a truck he didn't recognize pulled up along the road shoulder and a man got out. Younger than Earl or Roy, maybe 50, with the kind of weathered look that came from real field work rather than time alone. He walked up to the fence line with his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, the posture of a man who'd rehearsed what he wanted to say and still wasn't sure he wanted to say it. "You're Turner. Bought the old Whitfield Farmall?" "That's right." Caleb set down his fence pliers. "You're going to have to give me your name before we go any further. I've had about all the strangers I can handle this month who don't want to introduce themselves." The man almost smiled at that, though it didn't sit easy on his face. "Nathan Cross. My grandfather was Delbert Cross. We farmed the ground east of the old Whitfield line, other side of the creek." He glanced toward Caleb's truck, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, like he'd decided something on the drive over and was only now committing to it. "I'm the one who called Henry Cross before the auction. Didn't give my name because I didn't rightly know what I was asking for yet, or who I was talking to." "Earl's known my family 30 years. He wasn't protecting himself by keeping quiet. He was protecting us." Nathan leaned against a fence post, looking out over the field rather than at Caleb, the way men did when they were about to say something that cost them something to say. "My granddad and Wallace Whitfield made an agreement back in the 60s after a flood took the old boundary stakes out. Moved the line between our places to where they both figured it had always run, best either one could remember, rather than fight over paper that didn't match 60 years of common understanding. My family's farmed that creek bottom ground on the strength of that agreement for 3 generations now. Never had a lick of trouble over it because nobody ever pushed." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "Found Whitfield's ledger, talked to Earl. I know about the hitch, and the stone, and the 11 acres. Something in Nathan's face tightened at that, a flicker of real fear passing through before he mastered it back down. "Then you know what's at stake for my family if that boundary ever gets formally surveyed and somebody decides the old deed line is what counts, not 60 years of both families farming and agreeing otherwise." "I know what the deed says. I don't know what the law says about which one wins if it ever came to that." "Neither do I entirely. That's the trouble." Nathan rubbed a hand across his jaw. "There's something called boundary by acquiescence. A lawyer explained it to my dad once, years back, when we first started worrying about this. If 2 neighboring landowners treat a particular line as the boundary, in good faith, for long enough, and I mean decades, formally recognized, both sides acting on it, some courts will recognize that as the real boundary, regardless of what the original deed says. But it has to be provable. You need evidence the line was actually agreed to and honored over time, not just farmed by accident, agreed to." He looked at Caleb steadily now. That ledger you found and whatever's in Wallace's other papers and that hitch on the back of your tractor, that might be the only proof left in this world that the line my family's farmed by was a real, mutual, decades-long agreement, not just us quietly taking ground that never was ours. Caleb was quiet a moment, letting that settle. So you want the tractor to protect your family's claim, not to hide anything? That's right. Same as I imagine Sarah is holding onto her father's promise for a reason closer to the opposite. Because if that evidence disappears or never gets found, and somebody down the line decides to enforce the deed lines strictly, her family stands to get 11 acres back that they haven't actually farmed in 60 years, at our expense. Nathan's mouth pulled into something bitter. Funny thing is, I don't think Sarah wants that. I think Wallace didn't want that either, or he wouldn't have made her promise to keep the tractor in the family instead of just selling it off or scrapping it. I think Wallace spent the last years of his life scared the agreement he and my granddad made in good faith might come apart after he was gone, and he wanted to make sure whoever needed the proof could still find it. Then why not just tell somebody outright? Put it in writing, formal, get a surveyor out, settle it once and for all while he was still alive to explain it. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Because the honest answer, Mr. Turner, is that once you put something like that in front of a judge, you don't get to control anymore which way it goes. Wallace and my granddad settled it as neighbors, as friends, on a handshake and a dragged stone, because that felt fairer to both of them than what the paper actually said. Formalizing it risks a court looking at that same evidence and deciding the deed line's what counts after all. And then my family loses 11 acres we've worked our whole lives, fair and square by every measure, except the one written down in a courthouse 60 years before either one of us was born. Caleb looked out over his own leased 50 acres, thought about how tenuous his own hold on any ground felt most days, and understood for the first time fully the size of what he was actually standing in the middle of. Not a mystery about a strange old tractor, a live, unresolved question about who legitimately owns 11 acres of creek-bottom farmland resting on the memory of two dead men, a nervous mechanic, a grieving daughter bound by an unexplained promise, and a hitch Caleb himself had hauled home for $800 without understanding what he was buying. "Why does it matter now?" Caleb asked. "Why this year? Wallace has been dead since spring. If this agreement held for 60 years without trouble, what's pushing it to a head all of a sudden?" Nathan's face answered before he said anything, the particular look of a man delivering news he'd hoped he wouldn't have to. Because Wallace's nephew doesn't want to farm that ground, he wants to sell it, and he's already been talking to a land company about it, the kind that orders a full new survey before they'll close on anything, so there's no boundary question left unresolved before they build. If that survey happens and it follows the deed instead of 60 years of handshake agreement, my family loses that ground with no warning and no chance to prove otherwise, because the only proof that was ever going to hold up in a courtroom might be sitting in your equipment shed right now, and none of us knew it existed until you bought it out from under all of us. Caleb didn't sleep well that night, turning over what Nathan had told him against what he already had, the ledger, Earl's account, Sarah's unexplained promise, and understanding that whatever he decided to do next wasn't really his decision to make alone anymore. He'd bought a tractor. He ended up holding the only surviving proof of a boundary that would decide whether one family kept 11 acres they'd farmed in good faith for 3 generations, or lost it without warning to a land company's survey crew. He called Sarah first, the next morning, and asked her to meet him at the old Whitfield workshop rather than explain it over the phone. He called Nathan next, and then, after some hesitation, he drove out and asked Earl and Roy to come too. If this was going to get settled, he figured it ought to get settled with everyone who'd carried a piece of it standing in the same room at once, rather than 4 separate people each holding their fragment close and guessing at the rest. They gathered that Saturday morning in the Cinderblock workshop, awkward and wary of each other in the way of people who'd spent years managing a shared secret from a careful distance. Sarah stood near the door like she hadn't decided whether to stay. Nathan kept his hands in his pockets. Earl and Roy stood apart from each other, and Caleb understood, watching them, that whatever guilt they'd each carried alone for 30 years had never once been shared out loud between the two of them either. Caleb laid the ledger open on the workbench, turned to the page about the flood and the hitch, and let it sit there a moment before he spoke. "I think all four of you know more of this than I do," he said, "but I don't think any one of you knows all of it. I think Wallace built it that way on purpose, split the truth up so nobody could make a decision about it without everybody else in the room." He looked at Sarah. "Your father asked you to keep this tractor in the family because he knew someday somebody would need what it proved, and he trusted you to be the one who'd want to do right by that, even not knowing exactly what right meant yet." Sarah's eyes were wet, and she didn't try to hide it. "He never told me why," she said quietly. "Just made me promise. I thought, I don't know what I thought, that it was sentimental, that he just loved the old thing." She looked at the ledger, at her father's shaking handwriting in the last entries. "I didn't know it was about land. I didn't know it was about the Cross family losing something because of ground my own family technically owned on paper." "Your family's owned that 11 acres on paper since before either of our grandfathers were born," Nathan said, not unkindly but plainly. "We've farmed it as ours for 60 years because your father and mine agreed it should be that way. I'm not here asking you for anything you haven't already decided, Sarah. I'm here because if this ever ends up in front of a judge without the full truth in the room, we could lose it regardless of what either of them actually agreed to, and I don't think that's what either of them wanted." Earl finally spoke, his voice rougher than Caleb had heard it yet. "I built that hitch because Wallace asked me to, and I never once thought about what it'd mean 30, 40 years down the line. I've spent half my life scared somebody'd find out I helped move a boundary marker without a surveyor anywhere near it, like I'd done something criminal instead of something two neighbors agreed to between themselves." He looked at Roy. "We never even talked about it, the two of us, not once in 30 years. Just carried it separate, like carrying it together would have made it more real." Roy nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders eased. The particular relief of a weight finally set down in front of witnesses instead of carried alone. "I helped set that stone," he said. "Never told a soul why. Figured it wasn't mine to tell." He looked at Nathan. "Your granddad was a good man. Wallace was too. What they did fair, best they knew how. I've never doubted that, not once in 30 years, even carrying it quiet as I did." Caleb let the room sit with that for a moment before he said what he'd actually driven them all out here to say. "I talked to a land use attorney yesterday out of the county seat, told her the situation in general terms, not naming anybody yet. She confirmed what Nathan already told me. Boundary by acquiescence is real. It's recognized in this state, but it has to be proven with real evidence of a mutual, long-standing agreement, not just possession. She said a ledger like this, corroborated by living witnesses who were present when the boundary was physically marked, and the tractor itself as physical evidence of how the marker stone was moved, would likely be enough to hold up a formal claim, if it's filed properly, now, before any survey happens under the deed line instead." "And if we don't file it," Nathan said quietly, "if we just let the sale to the land company go through, let their survey happen, then the deed line stands, most likely, because there won't be anybody putting the acquiescence evidence in front of anyone in time to matter," Caleb said. "You lose the ground with no fight in it at all." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking at the ledger, at her father's handwriting, at 4 other people who had each carried some part of a secret her father had spent his final years quietly documenting rather than resolving outright. "He wanted this decided by the people who actually knew the truth," she said finally, half to herself. "He didn't want it decided by a survey crew hired by a nephew who never farmed a day of this ground in his life." "What do you want to do, Sarah?" Caleb asked, gently. "It's not really my decision. I just happened to buy the tractor." She looked up, and something had settled in her face, some decision made. "File it," she said, formally, "with everything. The ledger, the tractor, whatever any of you are willing to say on oath about what you saw and did back then." She looked at Nathan. "It's not my land to keep on a technicality my own father spent 30 years working around. If he'd wanted it kept for the Whitfield side, he'd have told me to sell that tractor for scrap, not made me swear to protect it." Nathan's jaw worked, and Caleb saw something pass through him that wasn't quite relief, something heavier, more complicated, the particular weight of being handed back something you'd feared losing at the cost of watching someone else give it up. The filing took the better part of 2 months. Caleb gave a sworn statement about what he'd found in the ledger and where. Earl and Roy both testified to what they'd witnessed and done in 1961 and the years after, the first time either of them had spoken to it to anyone outside the two families involved. The old hitch itself got photographed and documented by a surveyor who cross-referenced its build against the ledger's account of how the marker stone had been dragged and set. In the end, the county recognized the long-standing boundary as legally established, the way both families had farmed it for 60 years, rather than the line drawn on a deed nobody living had ever seen enforced. It wasn't a clean win for anybody. Sarah's family, on paper, lost 11 acres they'd never actually farmed but had technically owned since before she was born, ground that had shown up, dormant and unclaimed in any practical sense, on paper her whole life, and now didn't anymore, not even as a possibility. She said, the last time Caleb spoke with her, that it didn't feel like a loss exactly. It felt like finally putting down something her father had been quietly carrying for years without ever admitting how heavy it had gotten. Nathan's family kept the creek-bottom ground they'd farmed for 3 generations, but the formal filing meant the quiet, handshake nature of the old agreement was gone for good, replaced by surveys and legal language and a recorded boundary that would never again depend on 2 neighbors trusting each other's memory. Something had been protected. Something else, some older and more fragile kind of trust between families, was made permanent in a way that also meant it could never again be simply understood between 2 men and a dragged stone. Earl and Roy still didn't talk about it much for years after the filing, but Caleb noticed they'd started nodding to each other at the feed store in a way they hadn't before. 2 men who'd finally set down 30 years of separate silence and found on the other side of it that they'd been carrying the same weight the whole time without ever once checking with the other. As for the tractor, Caleb kept it. It still pulled the manure spreader across his leased 50 acres most weeks, same as any other piece of equipment on the place, and most days it looked like exactly what it was, an old Farmall, faded red, nothing remarkable about it at all. But he never looked at that reinforced hitch under the back end without thinking about what it actually pulled once, 60 years before he was born, and what it ended up costing and saving and settling long after the man who built it was gone. He'd bought it for $800 because he needed something to move round bales. He came away from it understanding that the things people build quietly and never explain usually aren't hiding nothing at all. They're carrying something too heavy to say out loud, and waiting, sometimes for decades, for somebody to finally ask the right question.